All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This is the MedDRA API webinar, and just a couple of administrative things. First, I'm joined by my colleagues from the MSSO, Shalini Gupta, who's our IT manager, and Glenn Lagerman, who's the developer of our APIs, and they may be assisting me as needed with any questions that come up during the question and answer session that we'll be holding towards the end of this webinar. If you do have questions, you need to use the chat function in the webinar tool. And as I mentioned, we'll be getting to those questions at the end of this session. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So this webinar, and the one that we had the other day, represents what we're calling the kickoff of our evaluation period for the MedDRA APIs. What we're looking to get out of this webinar is to inform everybody about the APIs we've developed, and in this evaluation period, we'd like to get feedback from everybody about the APIs as we go into implementation. And I'll be talking about what that schedule looks like at this point in time. So the agenda that we're going to cover is talk a little bit about why the MSSO developed APIs, and then we'll have some assumptions for this webinar. We'll also discuss the scope of the APIs that are developed. And then we'll go into a tool called Swagger, which some of you that have done API development work may be very familiar with. This is a tool that assists with understanding how APIs work. And then we'll talk about some frequently asked questions that the MSSO anticipated and go over those. And then, as mentioned, we'll be having a Q&A session, and you'll need to use that chat function to ask a particular question. So why did the MSSO develop MedDRA APIs? Well, essentially we did that because we are responding to user requests to develop this type of technology. And for those of you that are familiar with APIs know that they are what's called an open software model, as opposed to a closed model of a web application with a specific user interface that only allows you to do whatever that interface permits. And being an open software model, it is more flexible, and what it does is allows users to develop their own tools or extend the use of tools that they already have. And the APIs themselves, the MedDRA APIs, will provide a tool that accurately depicts MedDRA without having to know the details of the MedDRA data structure. And it also fills a gap in the current tool offering by providing these type of flexible pieces of software that you can use to extend your tools. Now, what's covered, and I'll go into more detail, is they do provide useful features for browsing and searching, and they'll be delivering all of the MedDRA versions and languages that we support. And as we add new languages and new versions of MedDRA, those will be available as well. Now, the assumptions that we have for this webinar is that you're familiar with the structure of MedDRA and various term attributes. So this includes things like the 5-layer hierarchy, specific attributes like LLT currency, multi-axiality, primary and secondary SOC, how the MedDRA codes are associated with terms, information about SMQs, etc. And with materials that we have provided with the APIs, the assumption is that you have an IT background and a software development background in particular to understand what we've provided. Now, having said that, this webinar is only going to discuss the APIs in general. If there are more complex topics that come up through the Q&A session, we'll be handling those either through our help desk or, if necessary, separate discussions, as they're just not possible to go over a complex issue in this format. So for those of you that have registered, and I assume that's most of you for this webinar, you should have received a link to some detailed information about the APIs. Included in that information is a programmer's user's guide, which contains all of the specific details of the APIs, all the inputs, the outputs, the request and response models, what all the parameters are, things like that. We also included a set of JSON formatted input examples that you can use to understand how the APIs work. And additionally, a list of frequently asked questions that the MSSO anticipated that users might have. And we'll be going over many of those frequently asked questions in this webinar. We also included a feedback worksheet, which asks some basic questions. And it's a way for you to give us feedback about the APIs during this evaluation period. Now, if you did not receive this information, Liz, I don't know if you have the link handy, but you can send it out through the chat function. And for those of you that may be viewing a recorded version of this webinar, you can send an email to our help desk at mssohelp@meddra.org, and they will send you the information. The help desk is aware that users may be asking for this information, so they have a link ready that they can send out to you. The one thing that I will mention about the documentation is, as we're in this evaluation period, it's likely that some of this information, particularly the information in the programmer's user's guide, will be changing. So just understand that it's not final documentation. So let's talk about the scope of the APIs. If you are familiar with the MedDRA web-based browser or mobile browser and the MedDRA version analysis tool, the APIs cover the scope of the features and functions of those tools. So what that means is that there are APIs for searching MedDRA terms and codes, the ability to browse the MedDRA hierarchy. So in other words, identify parents and children of specific terms, both in the MedDRA, the SOC side, as well as the SMQ side. You can obtain term detail information, so that includes the codes associated with terms, how those terms are linked, any SMQs associated with those terms, etc. There's also information about the SMQs. For example, if you wanted to know what PTs are in a particular SMQ, there's APIs for that. As well as the ability to obtain the detailed information about an SMQ, such as the description, source, and note for that SMQ. There are APIs that will provide the languages available in MedDRA and the various versions that have been published. Additionally, there's another API for those that are familiar with the self-service tool to help you verify the status of your business partners. As everybody knows, if you want to exchange MedDRA data with your business partners, whether that's like a pharmaceutical company to CRO, or you're providing some kind of tool to your clients, all of the individuals or organizations that are accessing MedDRA data need to have a subscription. And there's an API to help you validate the status of the subscription status of your business partners. We've also included APIs that provide the newer features of the web-based browser, and that principally is the SFU Analysis function. This is a function that allows you to provide a set of MedDRA terms, and with the output being the SMQs that those terms are in. You can perform a narrow or broad scope or an algorithmic search for the algorithmic SMQs that are in MedDRA. There's a hierarchy analysis function, which you provide a set of terms, and the output is the primary and secondary SOC hierarchy of those terms. We've also included the functions of the MedDRA version analysis tool. So that's the version report, which is a set of sub-reports that show what changes have occurred between two releases. So that's new terms, changes to existing terms such as promotions, demotions, the movement of LLTs, currency changes to LLTs, etc. And then similarly, the data impact report, which is where you provide a set of MedDRA terms, select two versions of MedDRA, and you're provided a set of sub-reports on the changes to those terms. So all of the features and functions of our tools there are APIs to perform those functions. Now, in addition to the documentation that we provided, we've also included a link to an open source software framework called Swagger. And for those of you that develop APIs, you're probably very familiar with this tool or a tool similar to it. And the whole point of Swagger is it provides an interface for you to understand how to use the APIs without actually doing any coding. And it's meant to be used with the detailed documentation and the provided input examples. Swagger itself does include abbreviated explanations of the API parameters to assist you. So on the slide here, you'll see the link that we have. This is also included in the Programmer User's Guide. And what I'd like to do now is give you a short demo of Swagger for those of you that are not familiar with it, on how you can use it and understand how the APIs work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of this slide presentation temporarily. And then I'm going to go to that link that I showed you in the slide, and this is what will come up. So this is the MedDRA API plugin for Swagger. And the APIs here are listed below. Now, before you can use them, the first thing you'll need to do is authorize yourself to be able to execute the APIs. And the way to do that is to click this Authorize button. You just click this checkbox here to give you access, click Authorize, and then you'll be taken to an authentication window where you'll provide your MedDRA ID and password. And this is the same information that you provide to the web-based browser, or the mobile browser, or the version analysis tool. And I'm just going to put in an account that we use for demonstrations. And then you'll get this other window here to confirm that you've authenticated. You just click close, and you'll notice this little lock symbol now shows locked, which means you've now authenticated and you can use the APIs through this interface to understand how they operate. So as I mentioned earlier, the APIs are listed here below, and you can by name, and you can probably guess what some of these APIs do by their name. You'll also notice that there are different colors here. You see a blue and a green. The blue color represent APIs that are just called through a URL. In other words, there's no JSON formatted request model associated with them, just through the URL. So that requires either no parameters or a small number of parameters, 2, maybe 3 at most. The ones in green represent APIs that do require a JSON formatted request model. So in other words, they contain quite a number of parameters in some cases that you need to provide that particular API to get a specific response. So what I'd like to do is to show you a few of these by example. First, I'll focus here is on the release API. And this is an API that just provides the release information that's available in MedDRA. This one, as I mentioned, in this case, has no parameters at all. So it's just an API call through the URL. So to use it, you just click the tryout button and then click execute. And what you'll see is the response body. So this is the response that you'd get when executing that API. And if you look closely, you can see the MedDRA languages listed starting with Chinese 12.1. That happens to be the first version of Chinese that was available. Then you'll see Chinese 13.0 and so on. Now you can download this information to examine it further by clicking this download button. And I'm just going to open that up so you can see it a little bit better. Okay. So this is the response body for the release API. And again, you'll see MedDRA Chinese 12.1 and so on. And then if you scroll down far enough, you'll see the next language, which should be Czech, if I remember correctly, and so on. So I'm going to close this up now, and then we'll take a look at some of the APIs that require JSON formatted input. The first one I'd like to show you is the search API. So I'm going to open that one up. You'll notice that there are a number, if you look carefully here, of parameters that need to be inputted for this particular API. And as I mentioned, we've included some examples that you can use with Swagger to understand how the APIs work. So the first thing you're going to want to do here is click the tryout button. And you'll notice once you do that, that this request model becomes editable. And you can edit this information directly if you'd like, or you can take one of our examples and put it in here, which I'll show you in just a second, and modify that if you'd like, and see what the results are. So I'm going to pick one of the examples, and again, this is information that we provided earlier. This is a list of the JSON formatted request models for the APIs. We have quite a number of examples here. So I'm going to click this search SOC example. And this is the request model. And what we're searching for is in what's called SOC view. So this is, the versus SMQs. So we're looking for the terms within the system organ classes. The language we're going to be searching is English. And we've included 2 additional languages, French and Hungarian, as additional output. And for MedDRA version 22.1. And the term that we're going to be searching is liver failure. So what you can do is you can copy this whole request model and you can just paste it into the window here. And once you've done that, you can click execute. And then you get the response. So I'm going to download this and give everybody a better look. Now the search function, the search API mimics what is currently done in our web-based browser, the MedDRA desktop browser, and the mobile browser. So for those of you that are familiar with that, we have a number of search categories that are turned on by default. These are exact match, lexical variant, synonym for synonym groupings that are included for each language, and then contains. So what you'll see here, if you look carefully at the top, there's the category here, exact match, and the name liver failure, and then the French and Hungarian equivalents of that, because that's what we asked for in the search. This happens to be an LLT that is current. And then if you move further down, you'll see category lexical variant, failure liver, and the French and Hungarian equivalent, the level, currency, etc. And then you'll see the next category, synonym. This is where we have these high-level synonym groupings for things like liver, hepatic, which mean the same thing, or renal, kidney. And it pulls up terms that contain, in this case, hepatic with them. So you have acute hepatic failure, acute on chronic hepatic failure, and so on. And then if you scroll down far enough, you'll see the contains grouping. Again, this is exactly like what you see in the web-based browser. All right, the next example I'd like to show is using what's called the type API. And the type API is designed to obtain the children or parents of requested terms. So I'm going to open that up, and you can see the request model here. So I'm going to try that out, and I'm going to go back to our examples. And in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to use the example of getting the children of PT headache. In other words, all the LLTs of PT headache. So I'm going to open up this request model here so you can see it. And again, we're going to use the SOC view. So in other words, the terms under the system organ classes as opposed to the terms in an SMQ. The code of the term that we want, in this case, PT headache, its level, and then the request type, R type parameter, C means children, the language, English, and then the version 22.1. So I'm going to just copy this. And then I'm going to just paste over what's in here. And as I said, you can directly edit this in this window if you'd like, or you can use the examples. And then when I execute that, then you'll notice that I get the response body, which includes essentially all of the LLTs under PT headache. So I'm going to download that so we can take a closer look at that. Okay, so what you see here is the code. In this case, this is the LLT code. The PT is the term that we actually requested, headache, the name of the LLT, the currency status, and so on. So all the LLTs are listed here under PT headache. Now you'll notice there's some other parameters here that aren't used, and that just depends on what information you want to use, or what you call in the API. So what I'm highlighting here are parameters, scope, category, and status. Those would be used if you, for example, got the children of an SMQ. So in other words, the PT is an SMQ. So those parameters would contain information. In this case, they don't, because we're focused on the LLTs of a PT. Right, a couple things I'll point out in addition. So I mentioned earlier there's high-level documentation or information about the request and response models in Swagger. If you click this model link here, these are the various parameters associated with this API and a little bit of descriptive information on what they mean. Now the details are in that programmer's guide, so I encourage you to use that, but this can be a very handy reference. The other thing I'll point out is at the very bottom, there are a list of all the request and response models for MedDRA APIs. Unfortunately, Swagger does not do a very good job of organizing this information. So to assist users in understanding which request and response models are associated with which APIs, we've included a table in the appendix of the programmer's guide that lists that information. So that may be something that could be handy if you want to use Swagger and look at these models more closely. But again, all of the details are also in the programmer's guide. Okay, so I'm going to go back now and continue the presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the frequently asked questions that we anticipate users asking. The first is, I'd like to discuss the schedule that we plan on for these APIs. Now, about a week ago, we sent out the documentation, which I've been discussing in this webinar. So again, if you have not received that, we will get that to you. If you go ahead and send an email to our help desk, or even in the chat that we have in this webinar, we'll provide you that link. So we're holding the webinars now, and between now and roughly around the 1st of April, we'll begin to ask users for feedback that participated in the webinars to see, if they've had a chance to take a look and absorb that feedback and take a look at what people are saying. And then between early April rather and August, we will be engaging users on a to-be-determined schedule to help finalize the APIs. This could be in the form of webinars, possibly other types of engagements to help us absorb the feedback and make any adjustments necessary before we deploy. And we're planning to do that in October of 2020. So I added this slide based on the webinar that we had yesterday, because this is an obvious question that we should have included but didn't. Is there going to be a cost for the APIs? And the answer to that is no. Just like all of the tools that the MSSO provides, there's no additional cost beyond what you pay for your MedDRA subscription. And in some cases, for some of you, that's nothing if you're a nonprofit or a regulator. So as I said, all of our tools, the web-based browser, the mobile browser, and that just comes with your subscription, no additional cost, and the same is going to be true of the APIs. Is it possible for users to suggest additional API functions? The answer to that is yes. You certainly may do that in your feedback. However, the MSSO cannot guarantee that we would adopt any of the proposed features or functions. And for those that we do agree have utility across the MedDRA user community, we could not guarantee that we'd be able to do that before the October deployment plan that we have. Our focus is to get this core set of APIs out first before we do additional work. Now, having said that, we are planning on future API functions, most notably for those that have been paying attention to recent events with MedDRA, is a SNOMED CT to MedDRA mapping. And this is SNOMED CT is a terminology that's mostly focused on the electronic health record. And we've been partnering with external groups to develop a mapping between SNOMED and MedDRA. There's a number of reasons why that's desirable. The upshot is that it is expected to improve health outcomes by being able to link the two terminologies. So when that mapping becomes final, which is expected towards the end of this year, we will begin to build an API that focuses on that mapping. And then any additional mappings that come about through engagements with other organizations, other terminologies, we will go ahead and build APIs for those mappings. So what is the versioning strategy for the APIs? Well, the way versioning is going to be handled is that we will be including in the header a version in the API call. And so what that means is if we change an API version, that will mean that the inputs and the outputs of that API version have changed. So users can still use the old version, and then they can graduate to the new version as they see fit. Now, this versioning strategy is not in place now. That's something we're working on, so you won't find it in the detailed documentation. But as soon as we make it available, we will update the documentation and inform everyone. The architecture for the APIs will be cloud-based in multiple locations to ensure availability, fault tolerance, and extensibility. Presently, the APIs are in a test environment, and we will be migrating them to this more robust cloud-based environment within a month or so. I bring this up because when we do this transition, the availability of the APIs could go up or down. So just something to be aware of. The security controls that will be in place for the APIs are going to be controls that are commensurate with the type of information that the APIs provide. So again, that's MedDRA terms and associated information. Those controls will include but are not limited to things such as vulnerability scanning, continuous monitoring, log monitoring, access control. And obviously, the API calls will require encryption. That's a bit of a no-brainer, but something that we need to ensure everybody understands. And then, of course, only users with valid subscriptions will be able to have access to the APIs. Now, I mentioned logging in the previous slide. We will be capturing logs from the APIs, but these logs will be focused on technical issues, utilization, and performance. We will not be capturing any kind of term input from users that use the APIs. This is true of all our tools. We do the same for the web-based browser and MVAT. We capture these logs for the issues that I explained, but we do not capture user-provided input. We will use throttling technology when the APIs are in the production environment to ensure fair and even access. We have yet to determine what that configuration is, but we will adjust that based on the usage. We are developing a service level agreement to go with the APIs. It will provide some availability goals. Our goal is to, at a minimum, provide 99.9% availability. And before using the APIs, users will be required to accept the license agreement before they can begin to make API calls. And the MSSO will not be entering into formal service level agreements with organizations. We are in the process of developing a test document to explain how the APIs were tested. It's not ready for external consumption, but essentially the document will provide a list of the inputs and outputs that we tested against our existing tools, which do not at this point use the APIs. This is how we validated that the output was identical to the current tools, which of course we rigorously tested. So if there are questions after the Q&A session that we're about to go into, you are more than welcome to send an email to our help desk at mssohelp@meddra.org. Please do include the subject of API question. This just alerts our help desk staff what the question is about, and it will be routed to our IT team who will respond as soon as we can do that. Now, in addition, we will be communicating any updates to the API evaluators, in other words, attendees of this webinar, both today and yesterday, and anyone else who expressed an interest after this period of time. So we'll be in communication with you about any adjustments that were made based on feedback or other types of input that we receive. Okay, so I think we're now about to go into the Q&A session.
And there are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, we will wait a few minutes to see if any questions come in.
Still no questions. If anybody has any questions, they can submit them through the chat function.
Well, let me ask the question, has everybody received the package of information that we included as a complement to this webinar? And by that I mean the programmer's documentation, the examples that I showed, the frequently asked questions, and the feedback sheet.
We have a couple of questions coming in.
Okay.
What is the role of Swagger?
Well, the role of Swagger is it is a interface that allows users to look at the APIs without having to develop any code. In other words, make any API calls, software development to use the APIs. It's a teaching aid so that they can understand the parameters and so on. So again, I'll show that quickly. Let me just get out of this presentation here. So this is the link to Swagger that's in the documentation in the slide presentation, and this is just the list of all the APIs that are available. These are the MedDRA APIs as of this time, and when you click on these, you get information. In this case, a request model. And then you can edit this request model, edit the parameters, put in information. You can use the examples, you can execute it, and then it'll provide you information output so you can understand how the inputs and outputs work. And this assists developers when they're developing their application so they can better understand what the format is, what the parameters are, and so on.
We have another couple of questions that have just come in.
Okay.
What is the plan time for mapping with SNOMED?
That's a great question. So as my understanding is, they are about to launch an evaluation period. So it's somewhat similar to the schedule I showed you for the APIs, which I think is going to start in March. That's going to go through September, and they're going to do a finalization period, which I believe will go into April of 2021. So at that point, the mapping will be final. Now the mapping will be maintained, which means that there will be changes at least once a year based on changes to SNOMED and MedDRA. And then, as I said, once that mapping becomes final, then we'll start the process to develop an API for that mapping to assist users, and likely that API will probably show up in a future version of our tools, like the web-based browser. But again, that's all to be determined exactly how that will be displayed.
The next question: if we integrate the MedDRA API into our internal tools, the API calls could be numerous in our routine coding activities. How about the performance?
Well, that's a good question. So as I mentioned, we do the architecture that we're going to deploy the APIs on will be in multiple locations, and we will be adjusting the architecture based on usage. So if we need to add more resources, we'll do that. But at this time, it's just unknown how many organizations will use the APIs and how frequently they will use them. But we'll be adjusting our architecture based on, over time, based on that utilization.
And the next question: how do coders use API?
Well, that's a question that could take up an entire session. That's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar. So what I encourage you to do is look at resources on the internet. We're just not going to be able to explain how that works in detail in this webinar.
The next question: if WhoArt is going to be subsided for good, because some programs still use it, our program implanted both MedDRA and WhoArt. not really a question.
Okay. Well, perhaps the individual can rephrase their question. I'm not exactly sure. Yes, WhoArt is no longer going to be used, and I don't know if you're talking about the Vigi tools that the UMC has developed. Maybe that's part of the question, but if you can rephrase that, that'll be helpful.
Perhaps there's a timeline when WhoArt is going to be no longer available. Do you know
That's
that answer?
I do not. I think that's a question for the Uppsala Monitoring Center, the UMC that used to maintain WhoArt. I can see if I can find that out. I just do not know off the top of my head when that is going to happen. And perhaps we could, if there's a way to flag that individual's question, we can get back to them on that. It should be easy to find that out.
Certainly.
Any other questions, Liz?
No, nothing come in after that one.
Okay, well, we'll wait a few more minutes. Again, let me ask the question, did anyone not receive the information package that wants to receive it? We can provide that link. Did you send that link out to through the chat, Liz?
Yes, I did.
Okay, perfect. So
if anybody didn't receive it, if you could just submit a question and I can make sure that you get it.
okay, Liz, we'll give it another minute, and then if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and end the webinar.
Okay.
Well, again, as I mentioned, we'll sit here for another minute, but let me take that time to thank everybody for joining. Again, if you do have questions after this webinar, please do email our help desk with the subject of API question, and we will try to get to that as soon as possible. All right, well, Liz, if there's no further questions, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar. We do appreciate your questions, and we look forward to the feedback on these APIs.
One just popped up.
Okay, sure.
Have you considered to make it as an open source project?
Glenn, can you help out on that? I think I understand the question, but
The API itself won't be open source, but there might be some code updates.
Glenn, you might want to get closer to the microphone. I don't think you're a bit distant.
Oh, sorry, I have my microphone up. The API itself will not be open source, but there will be some things that may or may not pop up as far as examples and stuff in the future. We're still discussing that.
Okay. Yeah, the APIs, just to finish that question, again, these are not open source. You have to be a MedDRA subscriber to use the API. So by definition, they really can't be open source. They have to be just for those that are subscribers, active subscribers.
Well, I'd like to add something to that. The reason the API won't be open source is there's some sensitive data in the API, so we can't, divulge that information. But,
Okay, any other questions, Liz?
No questions.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you everybody for attending the webinar. And Liz, I guess we can go ahead and close it out.
Okay, I'm going to be sending this link to this one particular person.
Okay, sure.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you very much.